What if Cliff Richard got into darkwave? This week I'll be taking a little look at the storied career of Cliff Richard, a performer whose cornier moments sometimes overshadow his vast importance to the history of UK pop. And I'll also be trying to discover what exactly is darkwave, something that I didn't know before starting the process of this week's video. All that and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and each Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. Then on Wednesdays I put out one of these companion videos discussing the artists and genres involved in that week's What If video, as well as sharing some insight into my process. The idea of the What If videos is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Devil Woman by Cliff Richard. I tried to reimagine that as a dark wave track, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. I think probably when a lot of people think of Cliff Richard now, unless they're particularly a fan, he quite often tends to be thought of in, if not a negative light, then certainly it tends to be considered as fairly cornball, quite cheesy, a bit embarrassing. I think people quite often think immediately of things like Millennium Prayer, or that mad dance move that he does in the Mistletoe and Wine video, or singing Summer Holiday in the crowd at Wimbledon, or his various Eurovision appearances. For various reasons, people's minds tend to immediately leap to some of the more embarrassing or less impressive incidents from his career. But however much dreadful stuff Cliff has subjected us to over the years, he's also a vitally important player in the overall history of British rock and pop, because I think there's a very strong case to be made to suggest that Cliff really was the UK's first credible rock and roller. Tommy Steele pipped into the post in terms of being the first British rocker to actually get a record out. I think Rock with the Caveman was probably the first from the UK, but it's barely a rock and roll record really. When you listen back to it now, it's almost sort of a swing novelty record. It's fine, it's quite good fun, but it's not really what you call rock and roll. Whereas when Cliff came out with Move It, that actually sounds the business. It's got that kind of menacing guitar riff, Hank Marvin there. It's got some real menace and swagger to it. Cliff doing his best Elvis impersonation. So it sounds the business, and he really kind of looked the part in those days too. And on those early records with the Shadows, he really did a pretty good job of bringing a rather more authentic American rock and roll sound to the UK. I've said in the past in these videos that I grew up with Chuck Berry. I basically pinched my dad's Chuck Berry double LP when I was a little kid. But one of the other records that I co-opted from my parents was this one, which is my mum's first press of Cliff Sings, Cliff Richard's second LP from 1958. The first one where his backing band are credited as the Shadows, because they were known as the Drifters on the first LP, until obviously the American group intervened and their name had to be changed. It's honestly got some pretty good stuff on it. The first versions of Blue Suede Shoes and 20 Flight Rock that I ever heard, before I ever managed to get hold of any Eddie Cochran or Carl Perkins records. And I loved it. You can already see on that LP the process of edging him more towards a sort of general light entertainer, because it's half a rock and roll record with the Shadows, but then it's half smooth ballads backed by the Norrie Paramore strings. But I don't think that's just exclusively a thing that happened with Cliff. I think that was happening to a lot of rock and rolls, particularly in the UK. I mean, Tommy Steele was very quickly moved from singing rock and roll to starring in musicals. But, you know, even American greats like Eddie Cochran, if you listen to his first album, it's got some great rockers on, but it's also got some much more middle of the road stuff too. there's definitely a feeling that I think a lot of record companies were hedging their bets around rock and roll a bit. They kind of felt like it was maybe a bit of a passing fad, so they'd give people what they wanted with it, but they'd also, if they were investing in putting out records by these artists, they also wanted to develop them as more well-rounded entertainers, so when this passing fad faded away, they'd still be able to have hits with them. So I get the feeling that's what was happening with Cliff from quite early on. But yeah, while he was still a bit rock and roll, a bit edgy, there's a few good records. And also, his first film, Espresso Bongo, is a classic of British rock and roll cinema too. Yeah, as a kid, I definitely saw Summer Holiday and The Young Ones, which are very, very corny, fun family movies. And so I just assumed that was what all Cliff's films were like. But Espresso Bongo, which I saw much later, much darker and seedier, proper kind of like fun youth-exploitation movie. And so yeah, he definitely did some cool stuff back then. And although it was only a pretty short spell before he moved very much into the middle of the road, must have been a really useful gateway for other young British acts who wanted to get into rock music but saw it as this distant, unattainable American thing, to see this guy who not long since had been Harry Webb reinvent himself as this sort of English Elvis must have been quite an inspiration, you'd think. But yeah, as I say, into the 60s, he very much moved into the middle of the road. He was making these endearingly corny film musicals. He started to be a lot more vocal about his Christianity, so he'd started doing a bit more kind of Christian music and blah, blah, blah. And he kept having hits. He definitely built an audience that was willing to stick with him. But then in the latter half of the 70s, it was quite interesting because he managed to somehow slightly reinvent himself and relaunch himself as a bit more of a kind of serious soft rock artist again in a way. And that's where Devil Woman comes in. Quite an unusual song for Cliff to sing, being as he is very outspokenly Christian. So to be singing about devils and witchcraft and curses, quite edgy for Cliff. Pretty hard-hitting rock track by Cliff standards as well. And it was, I think, his first single to ever sort of break through in the US as well. It's a bit of a classic. And from that point on, he had a bit of a renewed run of actually pretty good hits that all sort of inhabited this soft pop rock kind of territory. Carrie, which is I always thought was a bit of a good one. Wired for Sound, which edges a bit more into sort of new wavy, almost electro-pop territory in parts. So it was a pretty impressive career resurgence that kind of kept him going all the way through to the end of the 80s, really. He's still scoring fairly consistent hits, and even into the 90s with his brace of classic Christmas hits that he scored around then. I know in later years he's kept releasing records with a bit less fanfare and he's complained about ageism in the industry, but to be honest, he's achieved a much longer run of chart success than almost anyone in UK music history, so I don't think he had too much to complain about there. He's continued to be a solidly popular live draw throughout that entire time, both solo and with occasional Shadows reunions over the years as well. So it's been a pretty great run for him. I think, with him there now in his mid-80s, we can sort of look back and celebrate the fact that whatever you think of him overall, he definitely played a really important role in the development of British pop. And he's a fine singer and a charismatic performer, and he managed to move with the times, actually, I think, rather better than people give him credit for. That's not to say that I'm in any way any kind of huge fan. I mean, you could definitely fit all of the Cliff Richard songs that I ever want to listen to onto a single album. But that single album would be a pretty good single album, so fair play to him. We salute you, Cliff. Yeah, Devil Woman, out of his whole discography, it remains a bit of an outlier just because it's considerably edgier subject matter than the vast majority of the stuff that he released. The only other thing that he ever did, as far as I'm aware, that was as edgy was the Honky Tonk Angel single, which was, I think, a year or two earlier, which hilariously he recorded and then had to ask the label to withdraw when he realised belatedly that Honky Tonk Angel was actually a term for a prostitute. But Devil Woman, no such issues with it. It went out and was a massive success and it's continued to be a popular song, got a revival from its inclusion on the I, Tonya soundtrack a few years ago as well. And yeah, the reason I ended up looking at it this week was a few weeks ago, my mate Leo suggested that I do a version of Devil Woman in a kind of stoner metal Sabbath vein. But having a quick look around YouTube, there are so many metal versions of Devil Woman already. I just thought I'd be treading on people's toes if I attempted yet another one. So I thought I'd still like to do something with it, but I'd needed to find another style of music that was going to A, fit with the song's dark subject matter, and also B, be enough of a fun contrast with Cliff Richard's own personal sort of general style. And just thinking of dark music genres that I hadn't already attempted on this channel, the term dark wave sprang into my mind because it's a genre name that I've heard often over the years, but never really understood what it meant. I couldn't have named a single artist that I knew was a dark wave artist. Had a vague concept of what it might be, but I'd never actually looked into it enough to find out if my theories about what it sounded like were correct. So I thought, well, maybe now is the time to actually discover what dark wave is. Went straight to Wikipedia, which is, as ever, the refuge of the uninformed. I think it was more or less sort of what I expected. So it was saying the bands who would be considered to be the first generation of darkwave were all these bands who I would consider to be either electropop or goth or new wave or post-punk. But I guess it's just bands from the darker, spookier end of all of those genres. In the Venn diagram of these things are all included in the circle for darkwave. So people like The Cure, people like Depeche Mode, Gary Newman, the Cocteau Twins, Ex-Mal Deutschland. I think apparently all of those, to some extent, can be considered to be part of the initial generation of darkwave. And that kind of tallied with what I was expecting of the genre, but what was closer to my idea of darkwave was the second generation bands that were emerging towards the end of the 80s and into the 90s. These bands coming out of France and Germany and Italy, where those influences have coalesced into a bit more of a coherent sound, which is cold, gloomy electronica, sometimes with some rock elements, but quite often very synth-driven. People like The Frozen Autumn, I really enjoyed, an Italian band, I think, Diary of Dreams, who I actually used some footage of in the video for this, and a bunch of others. It was pretty interesting, and as far as I can gather, there are different strands of darkwave, so some that still inhabit more of an electronic space, but some that's more guitar heavy, edging into sort of the territory occupied by kind of industrial metal stuff, some that incorporates classical instrumentation and sort of edges in more of a ethereal neoclassical direction. So quite a variety of stuff, and it was really eye-opening because it's mad how even when you spend as much of your time reading about music and listening to music as I do, these whole scenes can exist completely below your radar for so long. So yeah, a bit of an eye-opener, and you know, if it's not something I'm going to pursue too seriously, there's definitely a few of those bands that I uncovered while I was just having to read up about it that I will be searching out some more stuff by, because it's pretty interesting stuff. But anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline, it's 1982. Cliff's just trying to figure out what he's going to do for his next record. He's had a big hit the previous year with Wired for Sound, with its kind of new wavy, slightly electronic sound, and he's quite keen to press ahead a bit more in that direction. But at the same time, he's been a bit stung by some of the critical reception that song had. People have said it's a bit cheesy, a bit corny, a bit lightweight, found his image in the video to be a little bit embarrassing, and you know, as one of the UK's original rock and rollers, he takes his image quite seriously and wants to be taken seriously as an artist. So thinks, well, what can I do to carry on a bit in that direction but make sure that people understand that I'm serious? So he decides he's going to delve into the darker, more brooding end of the new wave and electropop scenes to see if he can find some inspiration there. So it takes a little bit of time to listen to, you know, the ethereal sounds of the Cocteau Twins who've just emerged, the sort of austere electronica of Depeche Mode, the cold, glassy electro rock of Gary Newman, and some of the emerging gothic rock bands who are just coming out at that time. And he's really inspired by all of this. So he decides that the vehicle for him to explore these new sounds is going to be a remake of Devil Woman. So he goes into the studio and cuts a new version of it, stripping away that nice, warm, soft rock sound of the original and replacing it with this eerie, bleak electronica. And he's convinced this is the sound that's going to get him back in critical favour, but unfortunately the critics aren't buying it at all. They find it deeply unauthentic, and at the same time there's fans who have been very firmly in the middle of the road for quite some time, really not convinced by his new sound and stay away from the record in droves. So realising his mistake, Cliff very hastily retreats to the middle of the road where he's stayed ever since. So yeah, in trying to envisage this new dark electronic direction for Cliff, my first step as ever was just getting the original isolated vocal and dropping it into GarageBand, syncing it up to the grid. That done, the next thing I did was just slow the tempo a bit. I just wanted it to be quite brooding, so a little bit slower than the original. Also, Cliff's got quite a light, airy voice. Wanted it to try and make things sound a little bit heavier and more foreboding, so experimented a bit with changing the pitch of his voice. Tried lowering it a lot, but it sounded absolutely comical, so I ended up with him just dropped a whole tone, so just a little bit lower, but trying to give him a bit more body and gravitas. That done, next thing was programming some drums. Found a drum machine I liked, programmed in some nice kind of patterns, keeping everything very quantized, very robotic. Separated off the snare sound and added an absolute ton of gated reverb to it, just to give it that bombastic 80s sound, really dramatic. Next thing was some bass, again staying fully synthesized. So I picked a couple of different arpeggiated patterns that I liked, one of which I used for verses and one of which I used for choruses. So they've just got that electronic pulse that just kind of drives the whole thing along. I like that arpeggiated sound, so I used a couple of other arpeggiated patterns as well. So I've got one that just does a fairly simple up and down the chord thing that crops up partway through the song, and then I think coming in the second verse I've got a second one which is called something like French Funk Blips. It doesn't sound very dark wave in concept, but I think in context it works quite well. It just adds a different interesting electronic rhythmic pattern in there as well. Next thing, I wanted some pads to fill the sound out and create some sort of ambience. So I've got, I think, 4 different pads in total. Again, I used 1 pair for the verses and 1 pair for the choruses. So they're panned quite hard left and right, a different sound on each side. And they're just playing these ethereal, floaty, long notes that make a harmony between the 2 sides, filling out the sound throughout the track and occasionally dropping out to create a bit of a dynamic contrast. But most of the time they're there just kind of filling things up. And then I wanted some decoration over the top of that, so I've got a synth lead sound that plays some little melodic lines at various points over the top, weaving in and out of the vocal and creating a bit more melodic interest. And I've also got a pair of different synth bell sounds, again panned left and right, just playing harmonized riffs that add a bit more texture and a bit more decoration at strategic points too. I considered keeping the entire backing synthesized, but then I thought it'd be nice to have just a little bit of guitar on there. I wanted to do something like I've heard in a few of these darkwave songs where the guitars are really processed, so you're blurring that line between organic and electronic sounds. So I've got a couple of tracks on there. One that I've called Spooky Guitar, which is fed through, I think, a tremolo pedal, a flanger, and then a pretty long tape delay. So it's this otherworldly, ghostly sound, not very much attack and quite a long echo after it as well. Then over on the other side, I've got second guitar with a different sound. This one's got, I think, octave fuzz, quite heavy chorus and a digital delay. So again, quite echoey, but then with this fuzz tone, it just provides a bit of a contrast as well. And then for the video, as usual, started out by finding some footage of Cliff back in the day performing the song. There wasn't that much footage that I could find of him performing the song actually back in the 70s. There's loads from later on. I ended up using the Top of the Pops performance, which, I mean, they're always well shot. Annoyingly, they do quite often get copyrighted, but what can you do? So I used that as a starting point. And then I obviously wanted some authentically dark wave looking musicians to be his backing band, so found some cool live footage of Diary of Dreams, the German dark wave band. So I've just edited them in there to have them being his backing musicians. And then to add further to the dark wavy gothic atmosphere, I found some cool footage of 90s goth club dancing, so some cool little clips of the kind of people who I imagine would have been listening to dark wave music in the 80s and 90s. just cutting some rug to Cliff's darkwave version of Devil Woman in there. So I hope you enjoyed this one. As I say, I've always enjoyed the song, and it's something that I've vaguely wanted to do something with for a while. So when Leo asked me to do something with it, I was glad to have that little extra push to actually finally make it happen. I hope I haven't offended any serious darkwave fans by attempting the genre with pretty much no knowledge of it, but hopefully I did a reasonable job of it. I definitely enjoyed finding out a bit more about darkwave, and it is something that I'd like to broaden my knowledge of in the future as well. But yeah, if you did enjoy it, do please let me know down in the comments, and if you could like, share, subscribe, all of that stuff, that always really helps, and I'm always tremendously grateful for that. If there's anything you'd like me to attempt in coming weeks and months, any artists or genres or songs that you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. Your suggestions are always most welcome. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.